January 1946. Dawn breaks over a small village on the outskirts of Hiroshima. Smoke curls lazily from the charred remains of homes, mingling with the cold winter air. The streets are empty, save for the cautious shuffle of children emerging from the shadows. Their eyes, wide and wary, scan the skeletal ruins for signs of life, for scraps of food, for hope. From the distance, the low rumble of military vehicles grows louder. American soldiers appear over the horizon, rifles slung loosely, faces guarded but steady. In their hands, tins of rations, hard bread, dried beans, canned meat, simple sustenance in a land stripped bare. The children freeze, instinct battling instinct, fear of the occupiers, and a hunger that cannot be ignored. The smell of ash clings to everything, a bitter reminder of what was lost. Yet, as a soldier kneels, offering a tin to the smallest child, a flicker of disbelief crosses a child's face. Hesitation, then curiosity, then, slowly, a fragile trust begins to form. In this silent, ruined village, the first seeds of humanity take root, carried in the hands of former enemies who have become, if only for a moment, providers of life. The moment hums with quiet tension, bridging the gap between war and peace. By late 1945, Japan was a nation teetering on the edge of collapse. The cities, once bustling centers of commerce and culture, lay in ruins. The firebombing campaigns of March through August had reduced Tokyo, Osaka, and countless other urban centers to ash and rubble. Streets were impassable, lined with the charred skeletons of buildings. Smoke lingered in the air long after the flames had died, carrying with it the acrid scent of destruction. Civilians scavenged for food among the ruins, often digging through the debris of their own homes, desperate for anything that could sustain them. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima on August 6 and Nagasaki 3 days later had added a new dimension of terror. Entire neighborhoods vanished in an instant, tens of thousands of lives extinguished in seconds, and survivors faced radiation sickness alongside hunger and exposure. Hospitals were overwhelmed, and medical supplies were scarce or non-existent. The psychological impact was profound. Children who had never known safety wandered the streets, and parents struggled to shield them from both physical and emotional devastation. The formal surrender on August 15, 1945, marked the end of hostilities, but not the end of suffering. With the emperor's broadcast, Japanese civilians were confronted with the reality that their nation had lost a war that had demanded nearly everything from them. Infrastructure was shattered. Railways were damaged or destroyed, making transport of goods nearly impossible. Food distribution had collapsed. Tens of millions faced acute malnutrition, and starvation claimed thousands in the weeks that followed. In this landscape of deprivation, the arrival of American occupation forces began in September 1945. Led by General Douglas MacArthur, the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, SCAP, these forces were tasked not only with disarmament and demilitarization, but also with stabilizing the country and preventing further civil unrest. Soldiers landed at ports along Honshu, establishing control points, patrolling devastated streets, and initiating food relief programs. Military trucks carrying rations, blankets, and medical supplies began moving into areas hardest hit by war, often encountering skeptical and frightened civilians. Soldiers followed strict protocols when engaging with Japanese civilians. They were instructed to maintain authority, but not to act aggressively unless threatened. Orders emphasized restraint, respect for local customs, and the careful provision of aid to avoid provoking fear or resentment. Distributing rations required planning. Food could not be wasted, and priority had to be given to the most vulnerable, children, the elderly, and the sick. Yet despite the protocols, much was left to the judgment of individual soldiers. In isolated villages, where hunger was desperate, small gestures, handing a tin of beans to a child, breaking bread with a family, carried immense emotional weight. This backdrop of devastation, hunger, and fragile order explains why the scenes of American soldiers offering their own rations to Japanese children was so extraordinary. In a society where trust had been eroded by years of warfare, bombings, and military propaganda, such acts went beyond protocol. They were human, simple, and radical. A small tin of food, a moment of eye contact, could bridge the gap between conqueror and conquered, signaling not authority or dominance, but care. The stark contrast between the emptiness of the streets and the abundance carried by these foreign soldiers heightened the tension. Children who had scavenged for scraps suddenly face a choice: flee in fear, or step forward into the unknown and accept the offerings of former enemies. Every step toward the soldiers was a gamble, every tentative grasp of rations an act of trust. Amid the ruins of war, these small interactions were powerful. They offered a glimpse of hope in a landscape dominated by destruction, showing that even amidst total collapse, acts of compassion could resonate. The desperation of the Japanese civilians made the American soldiers' gesture remarkable, not only for its kindness but for the courage it demanded on both sides. This scene, set against the backdrop of ruined cities, widespread hunger, and a cautious military presence, prepares us to understand the cultural and emotional tensions that would follow. The extraordinary nature of sharing rations becomes even clearer when viewed through the lens of Japanese societal norms and wartime experience, a context where shame, honor, and suspicion shaped every encounter. Understanding the reaction of Japanese civilians to American soldiers requires more than a picture of physical devastation. It demands insight into cultural frameworks that had guided behavior for centuries. In Japanese society, concept of honor, shame, and social hierarchy shaped every interaction. The collapse of authority and the intrusion of foreign forces disrupted these norms entirely. Civilians were accustomed to discipline and order, even in hardship, but now they faced unfamiliar figures wielding overwhelming power. Fear was a natural response. Suspicion, ingrained by years of wartime propaganda and nationalistic teaching, made the presence of foreigners a source of anxiety rather than relief. For many, prior encounters with occupying forces reinforced this caution. Looting, confiscation, and violent enforcement of surrender terms had left scars on the population. Soldiers patrolling towns were not merely seen as enforcers, they were reminders of defeat. Children had learned early that strangers could be both threatening and unpredictable. Parents, conditioned to protect their young at all costs, hesitated, often keeping their children close in silence. The devastation of infrastructure, scarcity of food, and breakdown of social networks compounded the tension. Even minor gestures from occupying soldiers carried disproportionate significance because trust had become a rare commodity. The U.S. military anticipated this cultural friction. Troops received training on the importance of measured, respectful engagement. Officers emphasized restraint and the necessity of balancing authority with acts of humanity. Soldiers were instructed to recognize the psychological toll on civilians and to use aid distribution strategically. Calculated kindness could pacify unrest, prevent resistance, and, at the same time, foster goodwill. The distribution of rations, often seen as a routine duty, became an instrument of social stabilization. A single soldier offering his own food could humanize the occupying force, bridging a chasm wrought by years of war, fear, and ideological conditioning. Children were central to these calculations. U.S. military leadership recognized that feeding the young could have symbolic value far beyond immediate nourishment. Acts of care toward children signaled a new order, one where violence was no longer the only language, where former enemies could extend kindness. Yet, the first moments of engagement were delicate. Soldiers had to gauge reactions, move slowly, and respect hesitation, because missteps could instantly reignite fear or anger. Against this backdrop, the small villages of rural Japan became testing grounds for a fragile experiment in humanity. Every distribution of food was more than sustenance. It was a negotiation of trust. The cultural lens through which civilians interpreted these gestures magnified their impact. A child stepping forward to accept a ration was not merely hungry. They were acknowledging the possibility of a new relationship with those who had once been feared as conquerors. By the time American soldiers knelt to offer food to Japanese children, they were navigating not only ruined streets and empty stomachs, but centuries of social expectation. The extraordinary nature of these interactions lay in their subtlety. An act as simple as handing over a tin of beans became a conduit for trust, a quiet declaration that the war had ended and that, even amidst the ruins, life could continue. The stage was set. The devastation, suspicion, and cautious hope of the Japanese civilians created a tension that would soon meet the first tangible gestures of compassion. This cultural and emotional context sets the stage for the moment when soldiers' rations meet the hands of hungry children, a turning point where war's fear begins to dissolve into human connection. The most immediate impact of American soldiers sharing rations with Japanese children lay in the human realm. Soldiers, many of them barely older than the children they fed, approached the act with quiet empathy born of witnessing war's devastation firsthand. Years of combat, Endless marches and the loss of comrades had taught them the fragility of life. Yet now, amid ruins and ash, the roles reversed. These young men were no longer combatants in the heat of battle, but intermediaries of care. For the children, the experience was almost incomprehensible. Hunger had become a constant companion, yet the sight of a foreign soldier kneeling, offering food directly from his own pack, defied expectation. Shock, suspicion, and curiosity played across their faces. Some shrank back, uncertain if this was a trap. Others, braver or hungrier, stepped forward hesitantly. Parents watched silently, torn between fear of reprisal and relief that help had arrived. In these fleeting moments, the soldiers' humanity intersected with the civilians' desperation, producing an emotional resonance that would be remembered for decades. From a military perspective, sharing rations carried minimal operational risk, but significant psychological consequences. Soldiers were under strict orders not to engage in unnecessary confrontation, and offering food to civilians did not compromise strategic objectives. There was no danger to supplies at scale, and the act was controlled, localized, and measured. Yet the psychological impact was profound. Civilians, conditioned to expect authority enforced through force, were confronted instead with voluntary generosity. This subtle shift altered behavior across entire communities. Children became less fearful, parents more receptive to cooperation, and overall tension in occupied villages decreased. Such interactions reduced the likelihood of unrest and contributed to the smooth implementation of occupation policies. In a war-torn landscape, a minor tactical gesture became a major tool for stabilizing society. The rations themselves were carefully designed to sustain soldiers under harsh conditions. A typical U.S. Army field ration in 1945 included canned meat, hard biscuits, powdered milk, coffee, and sugar. Each package was compact, durable, and calorie-dense, capable of sustaining a soldier in combat or on long marches. Soldiers carried these rations in packs or distribution kits, allowing for mobility across destroyed towns. The act of sharing required more than simply handing over a tin. Soldiers had to portion food carefully, ensuring fairness and avoiding waste. They had to account for spoilage in the summer heat, the weight of supplies over long distances, and the need to maintain their own sustenance. Yet despite these logistical challenges, the physical simplicity of rations allowed for an immediacy of impact. A child receiving a tin of beans did not need an explanation. The gesture was tangible, direct, and profoundly nourishing in both body and spirit. In this intersection of human empathy, tactical reasoning, and logistical practicality, the act of sharing rations emerges as far more than a simple offering. It became a bridge between conquerors and the conquered, between suspicion and trust, between despair and hope. The behavior of individual soldiers was shaped and reinforced by their officers. American commanders understood that small acts of compassion could achieve strategic objectives while humanizing the occupying force. Officers encouraged troops to engage with civilians respectfully, to offer aid where appropriate, and to recognize that authority extended beyond the barrel of a rifle. In practice, this meant giving soldiers discretion to distribute rations to children, to assist elderly residents, or to provide basic medical attention. By setting this tone from the top, leadership transformed routine occupation duties into opportunities for trust building. The soldiers' actions were not spontaneous rebellion against orders. They were deliberate, sanctioned gestures, demonstrating how effective leadership could blend control with humanity. For Japanese civilians, the soldiers were former enemies, agents of the forces that had caused unimaginable suffering. The act of offering food challenged deeply ingrained perceptions. It forced a re-evaluation. Could those who had bombed cities and ended lives also extend kindness? This moral juxtaposition heightened the emotional weight of each ration shared. Former adversaries became temporary caregivers, bridging the gulf between combatant and civilian. The duality, warrior and provider, created a unique moral lesson for all involved. The capacity for humanity does not vanish even in the context of destruction. Beyond immediate survival, these moments carry profound cultural significance. In Japanese society, humility and restraint are central values. Accepting aid, especially from former enemies, required overcoming pride and fear. The children's hesitant hands, the parents' wary acceptance, and the soldiers' quiet patience together illustrated the universality of compassion. Amid the ruins, the exchange of a simple ration transcended politics, strategy, and national identity. It became a symbol that in the darkest periods, humanity persists, offering sustenance, trust, and the possibility of renewal. The convergence of leadership, moral reflection, and cultural resonance made these small acts of sharing far more than incidental kindness. They served as a template for occupation policy, a reassurance to traumatized civilians, and a lasting testament to the potential for empathy in the aftermath of devastation. In villages across Japan, these brief moments laid the foundation for a new relationship between former enemies, one rooted in mutual recognition of suffering and the quiet power of care. On a cold morning in early January 1946, the village of Kisa, located in Hiroshima Prefecture, lay quietly beneath a sky streaked with frost. The streets were nearly empty, save for a few women carrying buckets of water from a distant well and children huddled in the shadows of collapsed homes. American soldiers had arrived the previous evening, establishing a temporary outpost near the ruined town square. Among them was Sergeant James Miller, 24, a ration distribution officer, tasked with providing aid to the local population. At 8:15, Miller and two other soldiers emerged from their trucks carrying the day's rations, cans of corned beef, tins of condensed milk, hard biscuits packed tightly in paper wrappers. The soldiers moved slowly, deliberately, aware of the fragile psychological state of the villagers. Their boots crunched over shattered tiles and scorched earth. Smoke still rose from a partially destroyed warehouse, the acrid smell mingling with the scent of frozen soil. Children appeared first. A group of 4, aged 6 to 10, hesitated near the edge of the square, eyes wide and bodies stiff with caution. They had heard rumors of soldiers, but had never seen them so close. Parents remained behind, peering from doorways, tension evident in their knuckles-gripping wooden frames. Sergeant Miller knelt, placing a tin of corned beef on the ground, and gestured softly for the children to come closer. The moment stretched. Silence enveloped the square except for the distant groan of a train carrying supplies to a neighboring city. Then a small boy, no older than 7, in tattered clothing, stepped forward. His bare feet left faint prints in the ash. He crouched, extended his hand, and took the ration. A collective intake of breath rose from both soldiers and parents. The boy's eyes met Miller's for the first time, filled with a mixture of fear, disbelief, and relief. One by one, the other children followed. Some touched the tins hesitantly before picking them up. Others examined the soldiers' hands, searching for hidden threats. Parents began emerging, softly encouraging their children, their own faces reflecting a blend of caution and hope. Sergeant Miller continued to kneel, motioning for others to wait, speaking in slow, simple English accompanied by gestures. The soldiers' patience allowed the villagers to adjust, to recognize that these were not threats but providers of sustenance. By 9:30, the square was filled with quiet activity. Children clustered in small groups, opening rations, sharing bites with siblings, occasionally glancing at the soldiers with tentative smiles. Parents whispered among themselves, commenting on the soldiers' restraint, their willingness to kneel and offer rather than command. One mother, later documented in SCAP reports, remarked that she had never seen such humility from those we feared most. This first acceptance of rations was more than a logistical success. It was a psychological turning point. Hunger had driven the children forward, but the soldiers' approach, their calm gestures and respectful posture, transformed fear into trust. What began as hesitation evolved into interaction, and interaction into a fragile connection between conqueror and conquered. In the ruined village of Kisa, the act of kneeling and offering food marked the first true step toward reconciliation. By mid-January 1946, word of the events in Kisa spread rapidly to neighboring villages in Hiroshima Prefecture. Soldiers distributing rations were no longer merely enforcers of occupation. They became symbols of hope in a landscape otherwise dominated by ruin. Villagers who had initially hidden from the American troops began emerging, bringing children who had been too afraid to approach on the first day. Accounts from SCAP reports detail similar scenes in villages such as Fuchu and Mahora, children gathering cautiously, parents whispering guidance, soldiers kneeling, offering tins of corned beef, biscuits, and powdered milk. Soldiers' reflections, recorded in personal diaries and letters home, reveal the emotional impact of these moments. Private William H. Rogers wrote on January 18th, "I never thought I'd see their eyes light up like that. They looked at me as if I was something new in the world, a stranger, yet not an enemy." Others noted the difficulty of maintaining discipline while simultaneously engaging with civilians. Balancing authority with empathy became a daily negotiation. Officers observed that small acts of kindness drastically reduced hostility, lowered the need for patrol enforcement, and fostered cooperation in rebuilding efforts. The cultural and psychological impact was subtle but profound. For Japanese civilians, the repeated experience of soldiers kneeling and offering aid challenged years of ingrained fear and suspicion. Former enemies were now caregivers, their authority softened by gestures of compassion. Children began to approach without hesitation, learning to accept help while maintaining dignity. Parents gradually trusted that the soldiers' presence could mean protection rather than coercion. This shift in perception had long-term consequences for the occupation. Villages that engaged in these early humanitarian interactions experienced fewer incidents of unrest, smoother distribution of supplies, and more effective cooperation with rebuilding projects. SCAP reports highlight that the success of ration-sharing programs influenced wider occupation policies. Local commanders were encouraged to adopt similar measures, emphasizing psychological stabilization alongside logistical support. By the end of January, a quiet transformation had taken place. Streets that had been empty and tense were now filled with the tentative chatter of children, the careful movements of parents distributing aid within their communities, and soldiers moving with an awareness of the delicate trust they carried. In the aftermath of total destruction, the simple act of sharing a tin of food became a cornerstone of rebuilding social cohesion. In these villages, the first steps toward reconciliation had been taken, establishing a pattern for occupation conduct and highlighting the enduring power of empathy, patience, and deliberate humanity. The crisis of survival had given way to attentive connection between former enemies, setting the stage for the consequences that would follow. The days following the distribution of rations marked a subtle but profound shift in the daily life of villages across Hiroshima Prefecture. Streets that had been silent and empty now hummed with cautious activity. Children who had previously scavenged for scraps began returning to their homes with small portions of food, sharing with siblings and neighbors. Families, who had spent weeks hiding in fear or retreating to the edges of the village, ventured out to engage cautiously with the American soldiers. Immediate relief was tangible. SCAP reports from January 1946 indicate that villages participating in ration-sharing programs saw a measurable reduction in malnutrition among children. In Kisa alone, local health officers recorded a 15% decrease in severe cases of starvation within 2 weeks, a figure mirrored in surrounding communities. While rations were modest and could not replace a full diet, the supplementation of daily meals provided critical caloric support, sustaining many children long enough for more systematic aid to arrive. The psychological impact was equally significant. Parents expressed gratitude, often cautiously, their initial suspicion giving way to acknowledgement of the soldiers' restraint and care. One SCAP report quotes a mother from Fuchu, "I did not expect mercy from them. Yet they knelt before my children, and I saw that they were not here to take, but to give." Soldiers observed these reactions, noting that small acts of kindness were reshaping community attitudes, reducing hostility, and fostering cooperation. Alongside relief, small-scale rebuilding began. Villagers assisted in clearing debris, repairing basic structures, and organizing communal spaces where rations could be safely distributed. The soldiers' presence, once perceived as a reminder of defeat, became a stabilizing force. Their predictable routines of aid distribution and patrol reduced anxiety, allowing families to plan daily activities with a renewed sense of security. The immediate aftermath revealed that the combination of sustenance and respect could transform a war-torn environment. Hunger and fear, once dominant, were mitigated by the simple exchange of rations. The villagers' survival rates improved, and the first seeds of trust between former enemies were sown. The long-term consequences of these early acts of compassion were felt across the occupied regions. The American military, observing the success of ration-sharing programs, integrated similar humanitarian measures into broader occupation policy. Local commanders were instructed to distribute aid methodically, emphasizing psychological stabilization alongside logistical support. The precedent set by individual soldiers kneeling to offer rations became a template. Small gestures of care were recognized as critical tools in rebuilding trust between occupiers and civilians. Beyond policy, these acts shaped the narratives of reconciliation that would define post-war Japan. Villagers who had experienced direct kindness from soldiers often recalled the events decades later, recounting how simple tins of food preserved life and dignity. In oral histories collected by SCAP in the late 1940s, children who had survived thanks to these rations described a profound emotional impact. One recalled, "I had never seen a foreigner bend down to meet us at our level. It made me believe that the war was truly over." The influence extended beyond individual villages. News of American soldiers' humane treatment traveled through regional networks of survivors, fostering a broader perception that occupation forces could be trusted and that collaboration, rather than fear, could bring relief. This perception reduced the likelihood of civil unrest and enabled smoother implementation of rebuilding initiatives, from restoring basic infrastructure to reopening schools. The human stories are striking. In Kisa, a boy named Hiroshi Tanaka, who had been malnourished and weak when Sergeant Miller offered him a tin of corned beef, survived to attend school for the first time in months. In Fuchu, a girl, aged 8, who had hesitated at the edge of the square, later credited that small ration with giving her family the strength to survive the winter. These accounts, recorded in diaries and post-war interviews, highlight how a modest gesture could ripple through individual lives and entire communities. By reinforcing trust and fostering cooperation, these acts subtly reshape the dynamic between Americans and Japanese civilians. Occupation policies that might otherwise have been met with resentment were instead received with cautious optimism. The shared human experience of sustenance became a bridge over a once impenetrable gulf of fear and grief. Former enemies were redefined not through conflict but through empathy, creating a foundation for reconciliation that would endure into the post-war period. The immediate relief and longer-term effects of sharing rations illustrate a powerful lesson, that even in the aftermath of total destruction, compassion can guide the rebuilding of society, reshaping perceptions, restoring dignity, and allowing life to flourish amidst ruins. In the quiet aftermath of destruction, the gestures of American soldiers in post-war Japan stand as a testament to the enduring power of human compassion. Amid charred homes, frozen streets, and the lingering scent of smoke, a simple act, kneeling to offer a tin of food, transcended language, culture, and enmity. It reminded both giver and receiver that even in the shadow of total devastation, empathy could persist, guiding actions where fear and suspicion once dominated. These moments carry lessons that extend far beyond the borders of Japan or the context of 1945. They demonstrate that military power, often associated with force and authority, can be wielded in tandem with humanity. Authority does not have to rely solely on fear. It can be strengthened through care, patience, and respect. In the chaos of war's end, a small gesture of nourishment became an instrument of stability, trust, and reconciliation. Such actions reveal the potential for empathy to alter not only immediate circumstances but the broader arc of human relationships, even between former enemies. The children who hesitated, then accepted rations, and the soldiers who knelt to offer them, became part of a larger narrative, a story of survival, trust, and the quiet rebuilding of a fractured society. These interactions were not grand battles or historic treaties. They were simple, human acts with profound consequences. They remind us that the legacy of war is not only measured in the ruins it leaves behind, but also in the moments of humanity that shine through the rubble. As history unfolded, these gestures helped shape occupation policies, influenced post-war perceptions, and inspired stories of resilience and hope. They underscore a timeless truth. Even in the darkest periods, human compassion endures. It nourishes, protects, and ultimately bridges the divide between fear and trust, enemy and ally, destruction and renewal. In the villages of Hiroshima Prefecture, the quiet act of sharing rations became a beacon, a reminder that kindness, however small, has the power to transform hearts, rebuild societies, and echo across generations.